Hello, this is the Harbor and Light. I'm Mary. I give a conservative perspective about the world around me. Feedback is immensely important. Feel free to reach out. Two ways to do so: email and through YouTube. And as I mentioned, and I'll add on to this, I'm running an ad. Not this time. I'm also running an ad through the platform Audio Go, but Paramount Plus, so you can see me visually and then audibly. So on Paramount Plus, you hear something about let me rephrase it again. The Harbor and Light, that is my ad. And then on Audio Go, you can actually hear my voice. I did that one. And you have a visual with it. So, through the different platforms that Audio Go uses, primarily XM radio, Pandora, and the list goes on. You hear anything like that, that's about the Harbor and Light, that's me. All right, so I'm pretty much on all different platforms, so it won't be hard to find me. So it's Friday, so I'm focusing in on all of you. So this time, as I said, sorry about that, but I am going to cover both Korean literature from the 20th century and the Philippines literature from the 20th century. Here we go. Okay, so as I start out, I want to give some brief touching thoughts about it and get into it. And they both parallel each other. When we get into Korean and Philippine 20th century literature, because they both focus in on, not primarily, but most of it focuses in on the aspects of speaking politically about the worldview of everything. And so that's quite fascinating. Well, it's one thing where, you make, politics your whole life. That's a whole different can of worms in itself. But it's just interesting how when this is influenced into literature, how it can really shape and change the way it will be a catalyst point of seeing where the progression of culture, or the enlightenment of everything goes in a society. So with this said, I am going to read both, start out with Korean, and then wrap up and talk about the Philippine literature from the 20th century. All right, so Korean literature from the 20th century here. I'm pulling it right up for you. And give me a minute here. So, all right, so where it probably did that, but I'm not sure. Let's see. No. All right. So, transitional literature from 1894 to 1910. I'm sorry, just I have to speak to my daughter. Katie, you're making a little bit too much noise. You got to either go outside and play in the backyard, or you can't be in here. You're making too much noise.
When I can go outside and get my prize?
Just go right now. Go inside right now, okay?
I'm just going to tell me when I can.
Okay, I will.
Tell me when I can go inside and get my prize.
Okay. All right. All right. So everybody, it's spring break here. So my kids are out. So you hear kids. Besides Piper, she's not in school yet, but that's what's going on. Okay. All right, so getting back to it. So it says by the time of the 1894 reforms, social and intellectual change had occurred to suggest the beginnings of a division between traditional and modern literature. But just as conservatism did not favor of sudden changes in the political and social structure, literature too faced a period of transition towards its modern transformations. Schools were established by educational ordinance in 1895, and the organization of learned societies and Enlightenment movements followed soon after. So vernacular publications such as the Tong Nip Sinimum Independent and the Chikung, forgive me for pronunciation, I will try to do the best I can here. Chikung Sinimum, the Imperial Post, along with the establishment of the Korean Language Institution and the scientific study consolidation in the systematic of Korean grammar, also helped to open a way for the modern literary movement. All right, so the first literary forms to appear after the 1894 reforms were the new novels, and entitled with this called with songs. So these are transitional literary forms when they were simulated by the adaptation of foreign literature works and the rewriting of traditional stories and the vernacular. So these stories involved from hymns sung in churches, schools, and in the schools in the 1890s, and began to be popular among the publication of in the forms of national anthems. That's what it is. So by the Yi Yonggu and the Tong Sni Kai, A Boy's Mind, and the Yi Chong Won is an issue which was in 1896 of the Tong Nip Si Moon. So songwriters still use such traditional verses from the Sijul and the Kaja or as song form. So the predominant pattern of which 5 syllables show the influence of popular songs, which is in the aspects of Japanese formatted songs. So most songs denounce corruption in the government and stress independent patriotic and the modernization of life. So 3 distinct traditional elements were inherited by the Sing Sol. So first was the basic moral stance of revolving around vice and rewarding and virtue, and owing to the prevalent atmosphere of the Enlightenment period, and which was an advocate of modernization and were cast as virtue, while the wicked were cast as conservative. Now, second, the development of the plot was governed by this, and the evidence that lacked causality were nevertheless arbitrarily concerned. So finally, the dialogue and the accompanied narrative were fused into one expository structure. So the pioneering aspects of this, however, were that it was written wholly in prose, whereas a considerable part of the traditional function had been in verse, and the sing-sol tried to depict a plausible human existence with backgrounds and events that were more closely resemble of reality than was the case in traditional fiction. Now, which tended to follow certain model stories with their establishment in the plot lines and stereotypes and their characterizations. So writers of the sing-sol also tried to unify the spoken and written language. Typically, writers in their works were the Ying Link and the Cao Yu Song in 1907, A Demon Voice, to be an example. So Yi Yai Yo and the Yai Yong in 1910, The Liberty Bell, and the Klo Chang Sink and the Chang Shu Shaik, 1912, Color of the Autumn Moon, which is Color of the Autumn Moon. In their works, these writers advocated modernization and a spirit of independence and a merge with Western cultures and a study abroad to the diffusion of science, technology, and the abolition of convention and superstitions. All right, so I'm going to give some brief thoughts, and then I'm going to transition into Philippine literature of the 20th century. So this is a really good example of the aspects of how the 20th century was a breeding ground. It was a really good format for people to have a beacon to say, take a step back and say, we're going to find a way to move through the transition of being more modern. We are going to, either establish solely to be traditional and regimented tradition. Now that's a respect and a dignity with being traditional, but sometimes people can take it to the extreme, and the aspects on the other hand of modernism taken to the extreme of being too liberated or too free go what and to where it just has caused more destruction than anything. And so these literary examples of the Korean culture are, rich tapestries of diving into that. And so it's also a division of which, you can showcase and see how each division or sect of Korea thinks too. So, you got South Korea, which primarily is of a global process, an economic beacon, and it's for our own respect and right. Where with South Korea, it's, you got culture flourishing all around. Well, North Korea is not the same. It's more a regime to where it's just a totalitarian dictatorship to where, people have no say-so over their own destination. And so, literary formats really help to, fan the flames, so to speak, from that point of school of thought. But I think it's just a good talking point and conversations that get people thinking about, their disposition in that way. So with this said, I'm going to take a break and I'm going to wrap up by talking about Philippine modern literature. All right. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to wrap up, as I said, with the Philippine literature in the 20th century. All right, so starting in, let's see, we go to the 20th century. That's not correct, right? So in 1989, let me say it again. Sorry, in 1898, war between Spain and the United States was greatly influenced by the Philippine culture. The United States emerged victorious against Spain and took control of the Philippines in 1898. Although the Spanish coloners had established Spanish as the dominant language, the American coloners started to spread English throughout the islands after they took over. This language shift was very evident in the books and stories that were being printed in the Philippines in the earlier part of the 20th century. Literature was also greatly influenced by the introduction of public education. Soon, many educated Filipinos were publishing works in English. Now, by 1924, the first English language poetry anthology from the Philippines existed. So the Philippine poetry, which was edited by Rodolph Dato, was printed. Soon after, another anthology, the English-German Anthology of Poets, established by Pablo Lasso, was established. Some of the most famous Philippine poets of the era included the Teflano de Ericali and Salvador P. Lopez and Angela Manilang and Gloria and Jose Garcia Villa. So the American takeover of the Philippines not only influenced education and language, but also influenced the writing styles that were popular in the region. Stop. I told you, stop. Go on. I'm not going to tell y'all again. Y'all have to listen. Go inside the house. Don't go play in the backyard right now. Okay? You got to listen. You're being a little bit too loud. Okay. Go. I'll be in there. Just hold on. I'll find some more pizza for you. Okay? Yeah, okay, babies.
After that, I
Yeah.
want the pot.
Okay. All right. Anyhow. All right, so let me start over again. So it says the American takeover of the Philippines not only influenced education and language, but also influenced the writing styles that were popular in the region. So this short story, which was a popular form of fiction in the U.S., became also popular in the Philippines. So Philippine writers such as Francisco Arisana and A.E. Forgive me for the pronunciation. I'll try my best that I can. Ako wrote such short stories there. So in 1926, the UP Writers Club was established, and it continued to spread the influence of English language literature in the Philippines. Yet native Filipino writers such as Casino, Kalalang, and Paz Laterina added their own cultural influences to the craft. Major Philippine novels of the time were also important, as many of them reflected on the complicated history of the Philippines and the identities of the people living there. Now here we go with 1941 when we get into Pearl Harbor. All right, so following the raid on Pearl Harbor in the Japanese invading Japanese and then invading the Philippines, soon overwhelmed the U.S. and Philippine forces defended the island. So during the occupation, which lasted roughly 3 years, many Filipinos remained loyal to the U.S. due to existing cultural ties and the brutal behavior of the Japanese military. By the time a combined U.S. and Philippine force liberated the country in 1945, hundreds of thousands of Filipinos had lost their lives. Now, in the late 1930s, Wilfred Maria Guerrero became a popular playwright. He toured the one-act plays in a mobile theater and became popular around the Philippines. Poetry also remained popular, although much produced at the time had an American influence. The war itself influenced the literature produced in the country at the time, with the novels Without Seeing the Dawn in 1947 and Stefan Jabalana and Watch the Night in 1953 by Alberto Timpo, telling about experiences in the war. So in 1946, the U.S. signed the Treaty of the Manila, which granted independence to the Philippines. Much of the literature produced in the post-war period was published in English and written by authors who studied in the U.S. or England. Such writers as Alberto Timpo, poet Edith Timpo, and they wrote short fiction, and short fiction writer Francisco Arisalana returned to the Philippines after studying abroad, and many such writers also taught literature and writing in the region. Some of these writers were criticized for their adaptation of styles and language of different countries, and also occasionally ran into issues with governmental censorship. The fiction created during the post-war period also tended to focus on social issues and have a realist look. Now, this was very different from epics and the popular indigenous oral traditions, where you get mythologies and all this, and were often focused on magic and fantasies. As I was saying about the oral traditions of the Philippines, passing down mythologies, magic involved with that, and fantasies. So from the 60s to the 80s, Tagalog poets generated a great deal of work, including works in which they confronted political and social upheaval at the time, including the dictatorship of Fernando Marcos. So when I'm talking about Imelda Marcos, not Melda Marcos, Imelda Marcos, with her, way she was. I mean, those who know, but yeah, she was something else. And with going on Fernanda Marcos, who ran the country as either a president or a dictator from 65 until 86. Around the same time, the oral tradition was still practiced in some parts of the region. Poetry forms such as the Blak and the Baltaskin were still told by traditional storytellers, though these traditions continue to fade. Some younger poets became inspired by the fading oral tradition and penned epics and other poems that were similar to those that were told traditionally. So, magical realism, a form of fiction that was popular in the Americas and elsewhere in the 1960s and 70s, also was common in the Philippines. It's quite interesting because magical realism is very evident in the way in which a lot of a good case in point with Encanto. Encanto is, if I'm not mistaken, based off a book that has that same sort of mystique with the Mexican heritage, and it's very realist in the way that it's talking about the supernatural and blending these things in these characters, and it's very rich in that storytelling. But it's and hence realism, so it's not really sorted out for a general audience, and a lot of these influences, a lot of these influences were very cultivated or very showcased throughout the 60s and 70s, because as I mentioned in other podcasts previous to this one, that the 60s and the 70s was a time where people were, well, first with the 60s, it was more, being, going against the system and, being upheaval with politics and, just most of the time, most young people were, expressing, political agendas for the most part. And so when we transitioned to the 1970s, they're like, hey, this is BS. We got to, get out of this radicalism, the ones that were smart. And, we got to find a happy medium. We have to, move on with our lives. We got to, we're getting older. We got to think about careers and so forth. And so these things transition themselves in the way that pop culture and literature was written. And so, it's quite interesting how these things influence the way that Philippine, culture youth was thinking too at the time. All right, so by the end of the 1900s, modern cultural forces such as feminism that had an impact impacted literature in the U.S. and other parts of the West had also influenced some Philippine writing. All right, such changes also forced a cultural change in the Philippines in which readers began to read more works, even those from the past, of female writers. Now, in the late 1990s, here we go, the late 1990s and the early 2000s, where there was also a when this was happening. Let me go back and rephrase this. So, in the 90s and the early 2000s is when you see more female writers coming to play. So there was also a continued focus on writing that told about real life, as well as writing about magic and magical realism. Now, the modern period novels were one of the dominant forms of literature, though short fiction and poetry also remain important forms. All right, so this reaches the end, and I would greatly like to know what you all think. Feel free to reach out to me. And as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, the best way to do this is through email and YouTube. All right, so tune in, turn up, and absolutely take care. Bye-bye for now.